Thank you. Am I unmuted? Yes, I am. All right. Thank you so much. Yes, my name is Courtney. We're going to talk about credit a little bit, leasing versus buying, renting versus owning, a little bit about kind of making the decision when you get those paychecks of what do I do with it when I have a debt load, but I want to save and invest. Definitely ask questions. I have the chat pulled up. The more interactive this is, the better. Just make sure that what we are covering will actually be beneficial for you. And you can send those right to me if you don't want everyone to see. That's okay. I don't need to say your name. But just to get started, if there's more information you want to know after we talk, because there's no way I can go over everything, especially in this time frame, and everything changes so rapidly. There's no way to do that anyways, but definitely check out our website or our app. Or if you follow us on social media, you can get a lot of the same information, but we have information on credit, careers, adulting, budgeting, all that fun stuff. And there's a lot of calculators on there that I've used that are really helpful. But just to get started with credit, most of you probably have either student loans or maybe a credit card or some sort of loaned money right now that has started beginning, to establish credit for you. So you have a credit score and a credit report. On that report, it's going to have all of the identifying information on you. The most important thing is going to be that social security number. That's why you do not want to keep that in your wallet, your purse, anywhere where anyone could find it. You can find a lot of information when you Google yourself, but that's something you can't find. So it's really important, especially for your credit. You generate a score depending on how well you handle credit that ranges from 300 to 850 for FICO models. Typically, it's going to start in the mid 600s. If you do things right, it goes up. If not, it's like a GPA where it can go down pretty quick and take a while to build back up. Your credit report is going to be used for a lot of things. We're going to talk about that on the next slide, but your credit score is really important when it comes to what interest rates you're going to get on loans. A couple things that do not show up on your report I have listed up here. I think one of the biggest misconceptions is income. Just because you have a lot of money coming in does not necessarily mean you are using it responsibly or that you know how to maybe establish positive credit. I know when I used to process applications, some of the lowest credit scores I had seen were actually with some of the highest incomes associated with them. So it's really what you do with the money and obligations and debt that you have out there. So a lot of times people think of credit as just like loan approvals and interest rates, but there's so much more. It's used a lot for renting. So if you've lived off campus, maybe before, if you're at home right now, maybe before that, a lot of the apartment complexes do pull your credit to see if they want you to live there. If you're going for a mortgage, they definitely pull your credit and look at that a lot closer. But a big one is job offers. So over 50% of employers will pull your credit. They want to make sure that one, you're not in a bad place financially where you may be tempted to steal or do something from the company, or where you will be so stressed out financially that you can't really focus on work. Also, sometimes employers will look at it if it's between you and one other person and you're both just graduating, which congratulations. And maybe your experience so far has been similar, your education is similar, and they pull your credit report and you have been paying everything on time, you have low credit card debt, whereas the other person maybe has missed a couple payments. That might signify that they're in a bad place financially, or one or two, maybe they're just not good at meeting deadlines. And would that transfer over into their work life as well? Insurance is a huge one, especially if you like money. Your credit score is and your credit report are huge when it comes to insurance. I went through a training at the end of last year, and you pay more for car insurance if you have low credit versus if you have 2 DUIs, and the amount is significant. So it's crazy to me that that would have such an influence, but it does. And then think about it, if it's just that big on auto insurance, how does that factor over to other insurances that you have? And then utilities will also check your credit a lot of the time. All right, and then some true or falses. You can throw it in the chat if you think you have a guess. Having no credit is the same as having bad credit. Would those be the same or would those be different? Okay, so a lot of people will say that it's true, having no credit is the same as having bad credit. Other people will say false. I think this really can go either way. If you have no credit, or you have a typically low credit score, then you're going to typically get the highest interest rate on a loan, which can have a significant impact on your budget. However, from a lender's perspective, so I'm thinking like when I used to process loan applications, if I saw somebody that was not paying other lenders already, that made me really nervous. Like, if you're not paying them, what would make you want to pay us? But if there's somebody that doesn't have any credit established yet, it's kind of like a blank slate. So yeah, they might get a higher interest rate or maybe not get as much loan to them until they can prove that they can, handle that. However, from a lender's perspective, it does appear better. It's kind of like if you have a friend that's borrowed money from you a couple times and they never pay you back, you probably won't keep giving them money. Whereas if it's somebody that's never asked, you might just be like, yeah, here's $5. The next one, a debit card helps to build positive credit history. All right, so this one is false. A lot of times people have the misconception that it does, because when you insert your debit card, they ask if you want to do debit or credit. That really just is how it processes on the back end, and really the fraud protection and how long it's going to take to come out of your account. But in order to actually help you establish credit, it would be a credit card or other loaned money. If you think about it, a debit card is connected to your checking account, which is money you already have, whereas it would have to be money that would be loaned to you. And that's one that a lot of people have gotten wrong. And then the next one is, it's best to wait until you need credit to start building it. So would that be true or false? So I mentioned a little bit on the first slide that your score starts in the mid 600s. Um, it can take, a couple months to build that up, especially depending on how you're using your credit and what you're doing with it and how active you are with it. So it can take, anywhere between like 4 months to a year to really establish a credit score that could get you the lowest interest rates on loans. A good spot to strive is like 720, maybe 740 if you're going for a mortgage or something like that. But 850, you don't really have to strive for perfection. I've only seen an 850 credit score once, and I had to like double, triple check because I was like, there's no way. So really just keeping in mind, if you are going to be going for a loan that's a higher amount, like especially an auto loan, a mortgage, something like that, that could be tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, you want to make sure your credit is in a good spot, because that can have a big impact on your monthly budget. All right, so these are some of the factors that go, oh, okay, so I see a question about leasing and buying. So I will definitely touch on that once we get to that section, but don't worry, we'll get there. So this is just some factors that go into your credit. The biggest piece is payments. So if there's anything you can do with any loaned item, is make sure that you are paying that on time. So there's a couple different things that on time means. In order to avoid late fees and probably stay, in good grace with your financial institutions, that means paying it on the due date. But as far as for your credit, financial institutions and lenders do not report to credit bureaus until something is 30 days or more past due. So if you have a payment that's due on a Thursday and you get paid on Friday, and you just cannot make that payment on Thursday and you make it that Friday, don't panic that your credit is going to be ruined because of that one late payment. But keep in mind, there are late fees that go along with that. And you really do want to try and make a habit of paying on your due date. And if it doesn't work with your like pay schedule, ask your lender if you can switch that around. When you pay to like utilities, consumers, things like that, that does not impact your credit unless you stop paying on that and it goes into collections. Then it is reported on your credit, and that is factored into that payment history. So if you have any of those can really impact you. I know when I was in college, I moved every single year. And with that went the hassle of, moving my cable and all of those utilities every time. And there was one time where we forgot to cancel it. And there was like 2 months where we were being charged and didn't know it. And we weren't paying it, obviously, because we didn't know it was being charged, even though it was 100% our responsibility. So that went into collections. and took a big hit on my credit score. So a one late payment can take your credit score down about 100 points, and it stays on there for about 2 years where it can impact that. Next, it's looking at amounts owed. So when it's looking at amounts owed, it's not necessarily how much debt do you have overall. This is where credit cards can have a super huge impact on your credit score, because it's looking at how much do you owe in relation to how much you could owe. So if you have a credit card, it really wants you to only use like 30% of what you could be using. So if you had a limit of $1,000 where you could spend up to $1,000, they really want to see you keep that at 300 or below. Now I know credit cards, like especially if you were using them for books or things like that, might be a little bit higher, just making a plan to pay those down. And it does kind of factor in all of your cards. So if you have 3 cards, looking at what it's going to be, if you factor all 3 of those cards together based on what the total limit would be, and then the total balance that you have when you look at those together. So there's a question, speaking of credit, any recommendations for a first credit card or credit card type? So if you have a financial institution or someone you trust, that's usually a good spot to start. If you are somebody that maybe does not have credit established or you have a low credit score, definitely think about the credit union. While you are an MSU student and within 12 months of graduation, you qualify for the lowest rates on our credit cards, and our auto loans and a couple other loan options. So definitely keep that in mind. I would do some research on what good interest rates are. I know sometimes I've been in these sessions and somebody's asked, like, is 18% a good rate on my card? I know for our standard cards, it starts at 9.9%. If you want rewards, I think it's 13.9%. But it kind of does depend on what goals you're looking for. Do you want to earn cash back? Do you want to earn rewards? Do you just want to get a card with a low interest rate so that way if you do carry some debt on it, it doesn't have as big of an impact? So kind of thinking about what your goal would be with the card, and then thinking about if your credit would need a little bit of help right now, definitely think of the credit union. And I think we're the best anyways, but I'm not here to talk about that. Next is length of history. So how long have you been able to uphold these credit obligations? So it's looking at how long have you been paying on things. So this again is where mortgages or some of those longer loan items can help you, because the longer you're paying on those, the longer that's factored in. So here I'm thinking if there's somebody that had 3 credit cards open, 7 years ago, 5 years ago, and 3 years ago, and they decided they wanted to close one card and they didn't really have one that they liked or disliked more than the other, it would make sense to close the card that was open most recent. Once that history falls off, it'll still look at the other 2 and factor those together. Whereas if you took off the card that you had open the longest, that's where it can really impact you. And then you also think of, it takes away that history, but it also takes away that availability. So if it was a card that you had 0 balance on, then it's going to be impacting both of those fields. Not to say there's not times when it makes sense to close cards. There's just usually advice where if you are going to be applying for a mortgage or again, a higher amount loan, sometimes it makes sense to keep those open until you get that loan approval, and then you can close them and your score might take a little hit and then it'll build back up. So I know there's been times where I've had cards where I did not like the company that it was with. I didn't trust them. I knew it was going to impact my credit score for a little bit, but I was like, I'm not applying for anything right now. I'm not too worried about it. I closed them. I think my score went down 30 points, maybe. I can't remember exactly. And then it went back up after a couple months. So it was worth it to me. The next is new items. So when you are applying for mortgages, auto loans, I keep saying those, it makes sense to shop around because that interest rate is so important. So those are typically lumped together, but anytime you have your credit pulled, and if anybody knows the difference between a soft pull and a hard pull, you can throw that in the chat. We'll talk about it in a second, but really, if you are applying for those, it's typically lumped in and it doesn't have as big of an impact. But if you are applying for, say, 10 credit cards, just because you wanted to see what you could get approved for, that would have a huge impact. To credit bureaus, it's going to look like you're in some sort of financial trouble, because what did you do where you need to apply for 10 credit cards, or what are you trying to do where you need 10 credit cards to help get you out of that? So there's something called a Schumer box with those. So you can look at that ahead of time. We call it like the nutrition facts. If you're looking at 2 boxes of cereals, it gives you like the range of rates, any fees, how the card, if the interest rate change, if you're doing like a balance transfer versus just a purchase. So do that work ahead of time. But a hard pull would be when it could impact your credit. A hard pull would be anytime you have the opportunity of taking on more debt. A soft pull does not impact your credit. That would be like when insurance companies, potential employers, or you pull your own credit. And then it says, so if I am planning on closing my credit card that I co-signed with my dad because adult and try to get an auto loan, should I wait to get my own card until I get the loan? It may be, so this is hard because from a lender's perspective, they're going to look at that and see that it does have a cosigner with it, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but they can see that there is some sort of support there if something were to happen. So has it really been you making the payments or has it been the cosigner? However, it's not bad to have a cosigner. So I'm not saying that's a negative thing. If it were on your own though, your score would probably take a little bit of a hit. So it's probably beneficial to wait. Looking at what your score might be right now, because when you take someone off, I'm trying to think. I'm trying to determine, I don't know if you would have to actually apply to get that on your own, or if you could just see if they could have them removed. I'm guessing I would ask the financial institution that you're with. I'm guessing you will have to submit an application and then they would close that line of credit and open a new one on your own, which in that case, it would have an impact on your credit. If there's just something that your dad could sign that would remove them from that loan, and it wouldn't actually start a new line of credit or have your credit pulled. So that would kind of be the factors that would go into that. So I would ask. And then the last one on there is credit types. So this one seems a little bit weird to me, but it's just really diversifying your credit. I know for the longest time, I just had a credit card and my score was stuck at like 680, 690. Then I got to the point where I needed my first auto loan. And I had student loans, obviously, but they were in deferment at that point. I needed my first auto loan. When I submitted an application, my score went down a little bit after that from having, a new pull on my credit. But I think it was like 4 or 5 months after having my auto loan and paying on it, that's when my score finally shot up in the mid 700s. And then from there, as I've diversified my credit even more, it's gone up. But really just making sure that one of the big things is like if you have an auto loan for $5,000, it's important to try to not have more in credit card debt than that. A lot of times people will look at good debt versus bad debt, which I don't really necessarily look at it that way, but good debt could be like an auto loan, a mortgage, student loans, things that are getting you somewhere, and it's an installment loan where you pay a set amount per month and eventually that loan is gone. Whereas with credit cards, you can have a limit of $1,000, pay $20, charge that $20 back up, pay $20, charge it back up, and have it be debt that never goes away. So some tips, credit cards can be one of your best friends of establishing credit and getting your score in a good spot before applying for some of those higher amount loans, if you have the willpower not to just start swiping and then wondering how you're going to pay that. I did that. It doesn't work out. I was like, ooh, once I graduate, I'm going to have more money. I can just pay this stuff down. But then my student loans kicked in, and then I, had more responsibilities that I was in charge of, and it took a lot longer to get there than I thought it would. So one tip that I have that I do now is I have my Netflix set up to my credit card. So just one bill that you're used to paying every month already, set that up, wait for it to cycle through. Credit bureaus are only reported to once a month. So if you pay that, like if you charge gas on your card, and that's what you're going to be when you put on your credit card and pay off, if you charge it and pay it off immediately, the credit bureaus won't even really know that activity happened unless it's on the day that they are being reported to. So I wait for that to cycle through. I pay it off in full on the due date. So I have no interest assessed. I have no debt coming from it. I know I can pay that $14 off every month. And it gives me full availability and perfect payment every month. So again, just make sure you're paying on time. Review your credit is going to be super important. Over 30% of credit reports have errors on them. People reporting to credit bureaus are humans and they make mistakes. Keep your debt low, just view any errors that are there, and then do research and make sure you're trusting your gut when you are applying for loans. If something seems too good to be true, or you're like, oh, I don't know, I'm stressed, I just need this money, those are typically when we make some of those rash decisions and can end up with something that is not in our best interest. All right, so you used to be able to pull your credit from each credit bureau once a year, and then COVID happened, and now it's once a week because fraud is so prevalent. So just go to annualcreditreport.com. It does not give you your score without you paying for it, but you can pull your report, just look at what's on there, make sure everything's accurate, see where you're at. But yeah, okay, so now let's get into leasing and buying. So I have a question over here that says, I've been reading, listening, watching financial advice content, and one discrepancy between what my parents have told me is to buy your first car, not lease. The rationale given by the financial content I consume was that when you're under 30, it's better to build equity than debt. Is this a true statement or more case by case? I think it's more case by case, and I think it has to do a lot with what's important to you, your financial goals, and kind of where you're going to be budgeting that money and what your plans are. So for me, I'm somebody that I don't I as long as my car is safe and reliable and I'm comfortable driving my daughter in it, then I'm somebody that I think like if I can buy a car and just drive it until it gets to the point where it's not safe for me anymore, I'm going to do that. However, my best friend is the exact opposite. She is, in her head, she's like, if it's not a newer vehicle, in my head, it's not safe. I don't want to drive my kids into all this stuff. So it's going to be different for everyone. And it's going to be, are you somebody that likes a newer vehicle and you don't have to drive very far and you don't want to be responsible for maintenance or any of that? Or are you somebody that is really handy? So it might make sense to buy a vehicle where you can put the work into it later that you would need to do. So we're going to talk about some of the pros and cons. To me, I drive too much to ever lease. And again, I don't care enough to have like that brand new vehicle. Because a lot of times they're traded in 2-3 years. So just kind of what matters to you. With leasing, it is something that I did look into before I bought my last vehicle. Just really making sure you understand how the payments work, what's going to happen at the end. Are you going to owe on the rest? Do you trade it in? What your plan might be there, what options you have going into it, what flexibility you have, what things are going to be covered and what things might be out of pocket at the end is really good to know. A lot of times people do like it though, because with newer vehicles, it is more reliable. You're not having to do as many repairs. And a lot of times it can give you a lower monthly payment, but at least in my experience, and this was years ago, so things have changed a lot since then, but in my experience, it required such a big down payment that I didn't have that down payment. So that wasn't really an option for me. Some of the biggest cons is not being able to build that equity. So as you're paying on that, it's not like you are, lessening what you owe on the vehicle versus its value. And I will tell you, for me, that has been huge. My husband was in a car accident a couple years ago, and I had about $5,000 worth of equity in my vehicle, that we were able to, refinance my vehicle, take that $5,000 out at like 2.5%, and use that to kind of get by while he was unable to work and things. Whereas otherwise, we probably would have had to taken out a personal loan or drained all of our savings. And that would have really set us back a lot further, or it would have been at like 8, 9, 10%, which again has a big difference. So that equity can be a big thing. But again, if you're somebody that wants new, if you buy a new vehicle, as soon as you drive it off the lot, it loses so much value. So if you do want new, it might be better just to lease. And if you do buy new and drive it off the lot, make sure you have gap coverage would be one tip there. With buying, it typically does require a loan. So a lot of times it does require, getting a loan through a lender, getting approved, or you can do it through the dealership. A lot of times people do like it because you can do what you want once you buy the vehicle. And there aren't those limitations with how far you can drive. And you do have the opportunity for equity, but it is a lot of work. So when you want to sell it, that's all on you to figure out how to do that. If something goes wrong and there's a recall on the car, or there's not a recall, but there's something super wrong with it where they're not going to cover it, how are you going to fix that? The repairs, sometimes the payments are going to be higher. So just really making sure that you're up to date on all that stuff, that you have titled it correctly. So it's hard to say. So I can't give you an answer. Again, it's just going to be more case by case and what's important to you. I will say, when you're looking at your budget and thinking about things like that, does anybody really care what you're driving? Nah. Okay, so this can just kind of show the difference of having no credit score or a lower credit score, and kind of what that impact can be on your monthly budget. So if you had 720, you could get 2.74. This is just a $15,000 auto loan. And if you're looking at new vehicles right now, they're 30, 40, 50, $60,000 and more. This is to be paid off over 5 years. So if you had 638, your interest rate would go all the way up to 9.59% APR. And over the 5 years, you're going to pay almost $3,000 more in interest. So that's just an additional amount you're paying in interest. So just kind of thinking about what that impact would be if it was, a higher amount loan, if you did buy a new vehicle, or if it was a mortgage and it was, $200,000. Obviously the range would not be that large, but still just kind of keeping that in mind. So now kind of transitioning to renting and owning. Again, there can be a misconception with this because some people will say if you're not owning and you're just renting, you're throwing away money. However, some people will buy a house and then determine they don't like their job and find one and want to relocate. Or there are other things that come up and that might not be, a long-term option for them. So it's not always that owning is going to be better than renting. So kind of thinking about, if you're somebody that you do like to move often, you don't want to be stuck in one spot, or you are still kind of looking for a job or other opportunities, or that you're not going to be staying where you are for a long time, renting might be the best option, at least for now, especially because you can sublet it out if something does change where you need to move, sooner than that. But it does give you a lot more freedom. Sometimes you can, sign monthly, 6 months, a year, whereas with owning, a lot of times you do want to stay for a couple years. It can have implications on taxes when you sell it, if you make any money, on how much you pay on those. Are you buying and selling at the same time and kind of working through that? And then this, I don't think is a problem right now, could be tough to sell quickly. So a lot of times people, if they, bought a house and they were trying to sell it, it could be a long process. With the way the market is right now, we're not seeing that, but it can change at any time. So keeping that in mind. Then kind of looking at some of the costs with renting versus owning. So both take a chunk of money, typically right when you're going to be moving in. So with renting, it's that security deposit that you get back as long as you keep the rental place in good condition. Whereas with owning, it's that down payment and those closing costs. Your down payment typically ranges from 3 to 20%. And closing costs vary too, and sometimes they can be included in the cost that the seller would have to pay. But just kind of keeping in mind, sometimes with renting, it can be a little bit easier to figure out what those monthly costs are going to be and know a little bit about what that's going to impact on your budget's going to be going into it. A lot of times the utility costs are lower, or it's going to be the same amount each month, especially if it's like if you're paying for the whole unit. With owning, sometimes it fluctuates based on what's going into escrow, what your utilities are. A lot of times it is based on the size of the home, what those taxes are going to be, if you're still paying PMI, if you don't have 20% on the house paid off or yet. So just kind of some of those other costs that go into it. Again, with owning, you do have the opportunity to establish that equity, and you can borrow against your house, which again gets you at an even lower cost and saves more money to maybe consolidate other debt or things down the road. But again, keeping in mind, if you're somebody that is not set in a place, it's not like you have to buy or own a house to feel like you are, in that next stage of your life. Don't let that pressure get to you. Some of the value pieces with it, with renting, the pricing is typically set yearly. So it might go up each year you stay at a place, or you may be forced to move if maybe you don't agree with some of the things that are going on, or if the place closes down or they start renting out to other people. And then it can be subject to rules and fees that maybe you don't want to object to. With owning, there's so much that goes into it. There can be tax deductions and credits possible, which is nice, but you are paying a lot into it to begin with. The value fluctuates with the market. So I will tell you, about 8 years ago, we bought our house for $120,000. And now I think if we sold it, it would be over $100,000 more than that. And mostly just because of the way the market has been changing. Yes, we've done some work to it, but it's still just crazy how much that can fluctuate. Um, and I think a lot of people are going to see that right now because houses are not overpriced. Well, some of them are overpriced, but I think a lot of people are going to be paying that amount and then later kind of thinking about how is that going to happen. So again, keeping that in mind when you're looking at right now, do I want to rent or own? What do I think is happening with the market? When's a smart time? Looking at rates and prices of homes. And then just transitioning as we finish this up, just kind of thinking about investing and savings versus paying off debt. So I like to kind of start by thinking about like what cycle are you in right now? And how do you see yourself kind of, are you happy with the cycle you're in? Are you planning on changing that once you graduate? So it could be earn, spend, borrow, spend, where you're making some money, you're spending some, and then before you get more money coming in, you're having to use a credit card or borrow some money to get by, and then you keep spending. It typically transitions to earn, spend, which is living paycheck to paycheck. Then a lot of times people will switch over to earn, spend, save, where they earn money, they spend money, and then they put a little bit in savings, but typically end up pulling that out, or people will earn money, put some aside for themselves and save first, and then spend and pay all their obligations. A couple of things I like to think about are how much are you paying in interest on the debt that you have versus what's the dividend rate, or how much are you getting back on return for any investments or savings that you have? If your interest rate is 8-9%, but you're putting money in a savings account that's only getting, 0.2%, kind of thinking about, yes, it's smart to have savings and I still want to put money in savings so that I have that in case of an emergency and I want that built up too. But maybe the majority of any extra money that I have is going to be going towards this debt, knowing that once I free that up in my budget, then I can put more in savings and invest a little bit more. What are the long-term goals that you have? So that can be really important when thinking about saving and investing. And then what options and support are available. So one time that I think starting to invest earlier, even maybe when you don't have some of that debt paid down or savings built up, is when you work for a company that is going to match your 401k. So anything that you put in your 401k, I know for me, I put 5% in. Well, I put more than that, but if I put 5% in, the credit union will put 10% in. So for me, I would be throwing away free money that's going to be earning ridiculous amount of compound interest by not doing that. So it just would not be worth it for me. So that would be a time to really start early. Really thinking about with saving versus investing. That savings is going to be that financial base. With savings, it's going to be guaranteed money. That's why it's more secure, but that's why it typically doesn't earn as much. So you can put it in maybe a money market account or a certificate or something like that. It does have a lower rate of return a lot of times than investments, but it's guaranteed money and it's easier to access when you need it. With investing, that should really be for the long term. So money that you maybe won't want to use for 3, 5, 10 years. If it's money that maybe you want to relocate next year and you're like, ooh, this way I can have a security deposit or a down deposit for a house. Trying to invest and have that quick return typically is not the best way to go. There are some people where it works well for them, but pretty rare. But there is the higher risk and that higher return. So that's why a lot of times people will earn more on that because there's loss along the way. And that's why investing in that long term can help. That's also why diversifying your investments is huge. If there were people that had only invested in restaurants and department stores pre-COVID, they would be hurting so much. But if there's people that had invested in restaurants, department stores, technology, Amazon, they would have hurt in a couple of places, but the other ones would have more than made up for it. And there's still time for those other ones maybe to recover. When looking for savings accounts, definitely look for ones without monthly fees. Great question. So any recommendations for a high yield savings account? Do they even really exist right now? Not really, no. So the only good side of that is loan rates are really low right now too. They typically go down and up together. So when savings account rates are really low, a lot of times the loan rates are low. And as loan rates go up, a lot of times the savings accounts do as well. Right now, I've had a very challenging time. I had like a certificate that was earning 1.6%, and then it renewed the beginning of this year at 0.3%. So a very drastic change. However, I'm still keeping it in there because I know for me, it's just going to be 1 year and hopefully next year it's going to go back up. And then also the fact that it still prevents me from using it when it's in there tied up, and I'm still gaining more than I would if it was just my checking account. But I've also stopped contributing as much to that, and I am contributing a little bit more to my other investments right now because those are still doing pretty well. So just kind of my way of going about that. As far as recommendations, I've just stuck with the credit union. And as much as I love the credit union, I do think there are some options out there that maybe are offering higher ones. But again, kind of thinking about with going with that, what's the option of getting money there? How hard is it going to be when I access when I need it? And some of those other things. So just, I don't have a good answer on that one. I'm sorry. Okay, so looking at, this would be some student loan repayments, just kind of thinking again, that impact of interest. So if you're thinking, should I maybe pay this off a little bit sooner, or do I want to extend my payment so that I can pay less, put more in savings and investments? This just kind of looks at the impact that it would have on your monthly budget. And you would have a lot more freedom in your budget if you went, extended 25 years instead of 10. Financial advisors are great. You can do a free consultation with our financial advisors too. So you can call and get one free consultation. But it is so different for everyone. That's why it's really good to kind of get some of that personalized advice to see like, what are your specific goals? What's going to be the best option for you based on all those fun things that go into it. So yes, this looks great on the monthly budget, but when you look at how much more you're paying in interest, it is absolutely insane. So thinking, what would you do with almost $13,000 that you are not spending on interest? Would it make sense to, pay some of that off earlier so that you could not pay that in interest and then have that freed up in your budget later on in life, be able to put money other places? Again, thinking about what's going to be more beneficial, what you're spending on that interest rate or what you're gaining back in other places. So just kind of, again, talking about when it might be beneficial to start investing early is when you're going to have that retirement support. I know you're like, okay, we're just about to graduate and now you're trying to talk to me about retirement. And some of us are still looking for that place to look or place to work. But this will just kind of show the difference of starting early with that compound interest and just even being able to invest a couple extra, or if you take advantage of that match. This shows, I think it's a total of $36,000 difference between $100 per month and $200 per month. And look at how much it doubles all of that. So when you look at that principal and then that compounding interest, it can add up, and that's where it's really worth it to start investing in that retirement a little bit early. A typical rate of return is going to be 8% on a 401k. So kind of keeping that in mind too, of putting that money away that is going to just keep compounding and earning, and then will be there for you when you need it. One last thing that I'm just going to touch on would be the difference of a traditional versus Roth. A lot of times people will wonder when they should be investing in a traditional versus Roth. And again, it will be personal preference and different for people, but this is going to be how I do it and my advice. So really, when you have those lower taxes, that's where it's going to make sense to deposit into a Roth. So where you're going to pay those taxes up front when you're in that lower tax bracket, pay those taxes. And then kind of thinking about what tax bracket do you think you're going to be in when you retire? And then would it be worth it to maybe do a traditional later on in life when you would be in a higher tax bracket and you would end up paying those later on when you go into retirement? So just kind of keeping that in mind. But yeah, so this was a lot of information. So I'll stay around for some more questions that you have. Oh, here we have